when it comes to coaching, that's my heart. I'm a coach as a father. I'm a coach as a husband. I'm a coach as a pastor. I'm a coach as a friend. I think the hardest thing for anybody who comes to Potential Church is to continually be challenged, to not settle. Nothing thrills me more than to see people embrace something new, to go to new places, take advantage of new opportunities.
How can embracing your God-given potential transform not only your life, but also those around you? Join us on Seek, Go, Create, the leadership journey as we welcome Pastor Troy Gramling, the leader of Potential Church. With a congregation of over 20,000 members across the United States and Latin America, Pastor Troy has spent over 2 decades inspiring individuals to unlock their divine potential and make a significant impact. Today, he shares insights from his journey, from his days as a college basketball player and coach to his innovative approaches in ministry. We'll also discuss his first book, Potential, The Uncontainable Power of God Within You, and explore how faith can be a transformative force in our lives and communities. Pastor Troy, welcome to Seek, Go, Create.
It's an honor to be with you today.
You know, one thing I always like to do is honor people with the title that they should have. Pastor Troy Gramling, Troy, what do you like to be called?
Well, what I like to be called is Troy. That sounds, I didn't like the name growing up, but it's kind of stuck with me for 56 years.
56 years. Well, I'm a couple years older than you, so you and I are going to have a good, seasoned, mature conversation that for the folks in our age bracket, they'll relate to it. For the folks younger, they need to glean from the wisdom that we have.
That's what I try to tell my kids, boys.
My kids too. My son had dinner with us last night, and if he were listening in, he'd sort of roll his eyes just a little bit with that statement. So,
yes.
Anyway, Troy, hey, first question. Let's just say you're out somewhere away from maybe your domain, your people, and someone asks you what you do. What's your typical answer when people ask you that?
I would tell them that I get the opportunity to lead, to pastor, and to love on some pretty incredible folks.
And when you bring up the word pastor to people that are outside, let's just call it church world or Christian circles and all, I mean, I would get it. A lot of other people listening would get it. But when you bring up the word pastor to people outside of those worlds, what kind of responses do you get from people? I'm curious.
It's kind of funny. More often than not, if they're outside of that kind of world, I think I've never got a negative response. I've never had somebody roll their eyes. I can tell that they'll say that's good, but you can tell they really don't have a concept for what that means other than some kind of religious role they have experienced or seen to that kind of thing, and then just kind of move on, from that standpoint. But I've never really had anybody respond in a, religion or just some kind of, now they might once I walked away. In the moment, they all tend to be kind, but there's always a response, you know what I mean, of some kind.
You have that in that role. It's one of the few titles. I ask this question to start off almost every podcast episode now, 280 in, and a lot of people in business world, a lot of people that are working on certain projects, it's like this long, trying to describe what they do. You can typically say pastor, and most people have a connection right away. And it may not be great, but they know what you're talking about, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, I get most often, I know the folks who are listening wouldn't know, but the ones who are watching, because I have the tattoos and different things that people are surprised. So a lot of times it'll open up an opportunity for a conversation, because a lot of times they'll guess, you must be, I'm kind of tall. So they'll say you're an athlete or something to that effect. So it gives the opportunity to have a conversation.
Yeah. I mean, just let's kind of set the stage for those just listening in. We are on YouTube, so if you're watching it, you get it. But I think you look like you could be in like Coldplay or something like that. That's kind of the look that I have. I mean, you're kind of tall, you got the tats on the arm, you got an athletic shirt on, blondish hair. I know you're down in South Florida and all that, but I would say that people go, are you sure you're a pastor? Where's your collar?
Yeah, exactly. Especially down here in South Florida, because there's a big Catholic population.
One of my first contradictions as I was reading through your book, and I've got a copy of the book here, Potential, And I want to say this right up front. We're going to be talking about a lot of stuff, but this book is one of the main topics. This is my copy, and I just finished reading it. It's dog-eared and all of that. But if you are listening in, especially if you're watching this on YouTube, I'm going to give away this copy right here for anyone that pops a comment and says something related to potential or something related to what we're talking about here. I will, at my expense, because I actually accidentally bought 2 copies, and Troy hates that, I know. But I'm going to give you this copy if you put a comment down. So listen in, and I'll give you more instructions later. But as I was reading this in the first paragraph, I see that you're from a little town in Arkansas called Paragould. Did I pronounce that right? Paragould?
Yep.
Pair some of those together.
Yeah, it actually was started by 2 different railroad guys, Paramore and Jay Gould, I think were their 2 names.
Oh, it's good. So they combined it. Well, what's interesting is that I have driven through that town once, I think in like northeast Arkansas, and knew a little bit about it, but I went to Bible school for a few years out in Colorado, and there was a guy named Lance that popped into Bible school about 2 weeks after giving up drugs, showed up at Bible school. And Troy, he was from Paragould, Arkansas. That's my connection to Paragould. So I'm sitting here, this is my contradiction, my dichotomy I've got going on, and I'm going to have you explain it. You got a guy that grew up in northeast Arkansas, went to a town, Paragould, and it is small town, kind of rural-ish type thing. And now, I mean, I'm even looking at it. You've got the neon behind you, and you're in South Florida. I mean, what's up with that? That's quite the contrast in culture, if you ask me.
Yeah, it's an incredibly different contrast and a big change when we first moved here. Now, we've been here for 24 years, but I really think it's the reason we ended up here. The reason we left is the church. We had planted the church there in that little town, and you have the vision, and I had never seen a church plant. I mean, I had no idea how to do it. This is before books and conferences. The only time another church started is if people got mad. So, to kind of go out and do this. And we started it. You got the vision, you build, you grow, you see people come to Christ. And I got to that point where I just couldn't see the future. And I had never experienced that in all my life, where it's like, hey, here's where we're going. And then it's exciting, and just wanted to be where stuff was happening. And I'm not talking about just in the church. I just mean traffic even, just anything. So I really think that contrast in cultures has really got a lot to do with how we ended up in South Florida.
And the cool thing about that, and this is interesting, my wife and I grew up in the Atlanta area, and we kind of grew up small town, but Atlanta swallowed it up during the 70s while we were growing up there. And now we're traveling. We've been traveling for 10 plus years now, and we're in an RV, and we find ourselves gravitating now to smaller towns, smaller areas. We're just outside of Rapid City right now, and it's like 80,000 people. And I mean, there's great things about all places all over the world. I think I'd love to kind of contrast is give me some really cool things about small town and maybe some challenges, and then some really cool things about maybe the bigger city and some challenges. And I think that'll lead into, because I think that ties into potential. See, there are a lot of people that they believe they need to be in the big city, and they may. But then there are a lot of people that they really want to go smaller, and they may. Talk about contrast. Talk about pros and cons of Paragould, small town, pros and cons of big city, especially now that you've experienced both.
Yeah, Paragould, I think that one of the advantages of a small town is, you get to know more people because they tend to stay there longer, generationally often, folks whose grandkids are still there. I just think that there's a big relational aspect of it. And I think that's a really positive, part of growing up in a small town, because not only relationally in the sense that you know people, but when you try to get stuff done, there's a greater concern because they may know your cousin, or they grew up in this same small town. So if you're trying to get your reports at the hospital, or you're trying to get something done anywhere, really, there's always these connections. And even if you don't know the person, they know somebody, or you went to the same school that you did, or something that remembered you playing basketball or whatever. So there's a lot of that kind of connection that really you take for granted when you're a small town. You don't realize that the reason you were able to get that done, or the reason you were able to see that doctor or whatever it was you're trying to do had to do with where you lived. When you get to a larger place, what I've discovered is it's not that people are uncaring. They're just focused upon themselves. They don't know you. They got a lot to do. And so they're seldom, I'm not going to say never, but they're not seldom going to go the extra mile because there's no motivation. They're never going to talk to you again. They don't know anybody you know, most of the time. And so to me, that's a huge difference in the area. I also think that when it comes to ministry or probably any business in a small town, it's easier to build a reputation. It's easier to get the word out because it's talking about less people. And as a result, those folks are a part. Like we used to do a fair booth in the church that we started, and we would feed the fair workers, and we were highly involved in that. And they have a thing that they used to have, I don't know if they still do, but it's called Loose Caboose. And we'd be part of the Walk for Life. And we'd be a part of all those things in the community, which would allow us to minister. And it's also, an opportunity to put yourself out there, to market yourself. Where in a large area, you don't have that coming together of everybody. It's a bunch of different Walk for Lives, and the fair is 25 miles away, and the folks that are there don't do life. You tend to do life in small sections in a city. And so it makes it a lot more difficult to get the word out about who you are and what you're doing and what you're about in that sense. Now, again, I think one of the advantages is opportunities and diversity. You got a diversity of thought, a diversity of culture. And with that comes incredible opportunity. We're in a small town. People are kind of settled in their ways. And so the opportunities there's always opportunity, but not as many. Change is more difficult, I think, in a small town. More cultural pushback against change, there's so much change in a large area. People are coming and people are leaving and new businesses are starting. And so, there's always some challenge to change, but it's easier. It's not as necessarily tied to you. You don't become the black sheep because of some change you made. Where in a small town, you tend to do that. And then just the pace of life, I think, is a lot. I mean, you can run fast in a small town, but you have to run fast in a larger area if you're going to succeed to any extent.
Yeah, you led in. I was actually about to ask about the pace because in my mind, I'm sitting here thinking about that one time I drove through Paragould. And then also I've driven down I-95 in South Florida, Fort Lauderdale. We've actually spent some of our time down in that area. And I noticed that I just grip the steering wheel different when I'm driving on the interstate.
You are.
There's a little bit of a heart rate going and things like that. Let's go ahead and start bringing up potential into it. I think many times people believe they're supposed to go to a certain place or follow someone or do something like that. And very similar to the example you use throughout, and I'm going to love this conversation, is Moses throughout the book, is, Moses had what I consider three phases to his life. And I believe that many of us have those phases too. It sounds like Troy had a small town phase and now there's a bigger city phase. And talk a little bit about how important it is for everybody to kind of have this goes to a journey question, to have their own journey and not attempt to be copying the potential of someone else, which is a big topic for me.
Yeah, I think it's easy to get in a hurry, right? So in our effort to succeed, we tend to say, okay, here's a person who succeeded and the quickest route may be for me to try to become them. And I think there's a temptation to do that, especially when things aren't going the way you want. It's like, should I go like this person or be like that person? But I think when you think about it in the context of potential, it's always that we were in the heart and mind of God before he ever created us. So I'm going to find my greatest success. I'm going to glorify God the best when I'm who he created me to be. And so I can slow down and embrace the season that I'm in, whether that's a season of building, and depending on your age, depending on where you're at financially, depending on where your family, are you single? Are you married? Do you have kids? Do you have grandkids? I think all those things kind of impact the season that we find ourselves in. And I think if we can slow down and it's okay to discover, and I know, because for me, the big change was at the church I started. I've been at 3 churches. Originally, before I wasn't expected to be in pastoring, it was a 100-year-old Mount Zion Baptist church. And then years later, we started the church and then I'm here. But I think in that church we planted, I planted the church because God had given me a vision. Here, I didn't come here to be the lead pastor. So I had to wait. Okay, God, why am I here? Why have you opened this door for me? Where is it you want me to lead? How do I embrace who I am, especially in this different culture from what I experienced in Arkansas? And I do think in those seasons, you may borrow from somebody, but you know that you can't ever stop searching. I remember when I was playing basketball, I had a coach, and he told us, if you sprain your ankle or something, you put a brace on it. He said, but you want to get the brace off as soon as you can, because if you don't, your ankle will begin to rely upon it and it'll become permanently weak. And I think the same thing can happen when we're with our voice. If I'm not sure where we're supposed to go, I may borrow Rick Warren's baseball diamond or somebody else's whatever. But if I start relying on those things, then all of a sudden it's like that brace. I lose the ability to find my voice. And I'm never going to be as effective being somebody else or being in somebody else's season as I am with my voice. And I think, to me, that's the most important part of potential is the belief. I think the reason we do that a lot is because we give up on our own potential. The own idea that God can do something great with our lives, and so we're like, well, I'll borrow his greatness or her greatness, and maybe it'll rub off on me I get chills every time I think about the fact that I'm intentional. God created me. Now, sometimes I get frustrated about that because I'm like, God, couldn't you have done a better job? You look at this nose or ears or whatever it might be. But I think, man, if he created me intentional, he didn't create me to fail, then I can pursue who he's made me to be. I need to discover that and embrace that and grow that part of who I am.
One of the interesting things that I think is very challenging for leaders, I see this in business. I work with leaders and leadership teams, primarily in companies, some in ministries, but primarily in companies. And I do see people at times attempting to copy somebody else. Mm. But I don't know if this is just an observation of mine. You can correct me if I'm wrong or anything like that. But I see a lot of copying in what we'll call that pastor church world role. A lot of programs that someone will say, oh, well, these people have added blank number of people. We need to do something similar and all that. And I bring that up because I'd love for you to comment on it. And, I'm not asking you to throw anybody under the bus or anything like that, but I'd like for you to comment on it and then maybe follow it up with, it seems as if, I don't know, you mentioned intentional. I don't know how intentional this is. It seems as if you sort of push the envelope to either be different or do your own thing, to reach your own potential, might be a way of saying it, by, doing things like you talk about in the book, living in a glass house, which I'm sitting here reading you talking about that sermon and all, and you and your wife. I'm like going, good gracious, what a woman she is to put up with that type stuff. Sure. I'd like to meet that Stephanie. Talk a little bit about the industry. Let's talk about pastors in general and how they seem to be copycats a lot. So you could comment on that and then talk about what you've done to maybe avoid that to reach your potential.
Yeah. I think there's probably some truth to that because of the ease of information, right? What anybody's doing, you're able to discover. And I think some of it is a result of just the time crunch and the demands of ministry. Creativity is one of our ethos, and we talk about the definition is just stay in the room past the first idea, right? But that takes time. And some people are more wired administratively, so it's like, where do you want to eat? The first place that somebody comes up with, they're ready to go. Where somebody else is going to say, well, what about here? And so I think in ministry, a lot of times what happens is it's accessible, and not only is it accessible to the pastor, but the pastor's going every weekend and hearing about so-and-so. Oh man, did you hear so-and-so's teaching? Or man, I downloaded so-and-so's worship album. And, so the pastor's dealing with, man, I'm competing. I always think of it this way. I'm competing with them listening to their favorite teacher talk about their favorite subject. And I'm trying to teach the whole counsel of God's word, on a weekly basis. So I think pastors feel that pressure. And then I think, that week gets busy and, here's a program or a teaching or whatever, and they jump into that. I think the important thing is if you're going to, borrow whatever word you want to use there, maybe steal what some would say. I think the question you have to ask yourself, is this really me? Is this passion from me? And because if you do, there's going to be a transformation of it in some way. You know what I'm saying? Whether it's a teaching or, hey, you guys have this thing, and so we're going to do it as well. If I went to both, I might see that it's similar, but I'd struggle to see that it's the same, where you got it per se. To me, that's one of the things I think it's important is to, again, like we were talking earlier, is to be vulnerable and to be authentic and to be real, because people can pick up on that really quick. And I think there's that danger that you have to steer away from. For me, there's a part of me that is creative. And so I'm curious. So I'm always asking questions. And so that makes it easier for me to be original, you know what I mean? Just because I'm wired that way. I remember the first time I heard live Pastor Joel speak, and he's telling all these old preacher jokes that I heard when I was a kid going to conferences, and people are dying laughing. And I'm thinking, I stopped sharing those little stories or whatever. And yet they continue to be effective in the sense of drawing those crowds in because people love that. So I think if you're noticing it, right, then I have to ask myself, is it really me? If you can see clearly that I'm just following along here. And I think as a preacher, as a pastor, as a leader, I just got to be careful that I don't lose myself.
Here's the weird thing about that. It's just interesting you bringing up Pastor Joel, who kind of, we'll call it reusing, maybe playing the greatest hits. There's a line from a movie, if you go see the Rolling Stones and they don't sing Satisfaction, you're going to be pretty ticked. And I've been seeing clips on social media of the Eagles, which is a band from my, formative years. It's now 50 years in. Wow. And the first song that they rip into is Hotel California. And it's like, if you went to see them, I think they're at the Sphere now in Las Vegas. If you go to see them and they don't play Hotel California, you're probably gonna be pretty miffed. And they play those same. Don Henley has been playing that song forever, so I don't think they're cranking out any new stuff. So there is a little bit of a repeat, and then also there's create. And I think we're probably getting to a place where there's not a lot of new under the sun, but I think Tim can make it his, Troy can make it his. And I think that's where we can maybe tie into the potential talk. I do want to say in the book, it's very rare that I get references like Yoda, Bob Marley, Karate Kid, and all that, all in like one book, and she tie all that together. Yeah. So related to, let's still keep on this theme of potential. What I'd like to do is back up a little bit, because you talk about a good bit of some highs and some lows in your life in the book. But I think what I'd love to do right now, because here on our podcast, we don't shy away from defining success. And when we define it, though, we don't really look at the superficial of success. We talk about redefining success. And I even think you had a reference on one of the pages I saw, I highlighted it, where you mentioned a redefining of success. But what are some things, go back, let's look at the Troy story here. Go back and tell me a few times over the course of your life where you've had to redefine what success looks like. And I think I'm going to go ahead and tee it up a little bit. I'd love for you to go back to your sports days, because I find that people that have aspirations of athletics, it can often be difficult when they realize that they're not going to live off athletics for a longer period of time. So if you want to do something different, that's fine. But I'd love to hear definitely about the basketball and coaching. And so when are some times you've had to redefine success in your life?
I think as I stopped playing basketball, because in basketball, you have a scoreboard and it's very defined. And not only do you have a scoreboard, you have stats, right? And what a good basketball player is pretty defined. If you score this many and this percentage, then you're this style of player. And at the end of the game, you win or you lose. And I remember, because I wasn't planning on going into ministry, I was planning on coaching. That was really what the direction I thought I was headed. And that was difficult to wrestle with. So what is success? I can step down off the platform and I can have one person say, man, God used that to change my life. And another person be incredibly critical about what same teaching. So did I win or did I lose? Did I honor God? Well, that's a harder question to answer. I mean, I've got what I feel the Spirit in my heart, and I've got the people that I trust, but those are subjective, right? Because we're all people and we like and dislike and all of that. So to me, that's the one that maybe I have struggled with the most, is because, I mean, I don't like losing, but I like to know when I'm losing. And in ministry, you often hear people will say, well, if we just reach one person, if we just touch one person, and that always sounds really good, but some just touch one person. And it's not that one person doesn't matter. Jesus left the 99 to go after the one. The one does have great value, but the question is always, what's the best way in which to reach the one? But having to redefine it there, I think was incredibly challenging. And I don't know along the way if I've ever actually, I mean, I can say something, but what do I feel? Because success from my mouth and from my heart are often different things. I mean, I know what I'm supposed to say success is, but then I also know the pressures of the external things that people would declare success. And so I think, for me, that's a continuing wrestling match. And then I think as I get older, like I'm going to die. Do I retire? I've got kids that are in the ministry that are gifted in some of the same areas as me. So am I in the way of them? Am I in the way of the church? When does that happen? You got Erwin McManus is 66, 67, still going strong. I know Bill Hybels at one time in his early 50s was thinking about succession and stuff. So you got it all over the board and figuring out what God wants and what's best for the church. And then what success looks like in those things. During COVID is another time having to redefine speaking to an empty auditorium. We took from our database, we took pictures of people and put them on the chairs. Because you know what? It's so funny because you often hear preachers say, I love to preach. It's the people that give me a difficulty. And I love opportunity to lead and coach. So I enjoy people in that sense. But I didn't know how much until COVID, to be honest. I mean, it was emotional in a way to teach. Not there's the lack of energy of an empty crowd, nobody there. There's all of that. I just felt a longing that I didn't know I really would have, because in some ways, pastors got what they always wanted during COVID. You know, you couldn't be around people, but you still had to preach. I remember the first weekend we opened up and you're thinking, well, we're going to have this giant crowd of people. Of course we didn't, but I just remember the emotional aspect of seeing people out there and realizing that God, whatever we do is again, intentional. And that as a pastor, I have a calling that impacts my heart in ways that I don't always understand. And that was one of those times where it's like, okay, you know, and during that whole time, you're thinking, what does success look like? Is it this number? Is it this amount of changed lives? All those different kinds of things. So I think we're always changing too and growing. So in some ways, my kids, grandkids, their lives. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's a continual process.
What it does, I think it highlights the challenge that we all face in attempting to define it. And there are a couple things that came to mind while you were saying that, Troy, and I'll bring them up here. One of the things when I'm doing research and doing bios and all for the podcast, I kind of look at things and I go, that's an interesting thing. But one of the things that always occurs with pastors, I'm not saying this is a good thing or a bad thing, I'm just going to kind of call it out and then we can discuss it, is there's usually a number associated with the size of their congregation. And I think we feel compelled to do that. You know, I think 20,000 members is kind of the number that y'all have. And I guess a question I want to ask you right here is that a good measure of success for church world? I don't know. I ask it a lot. Sometimes I could be cynical too, by the way, just so you know. I'm going to go ahead and telegraph that. I could be cynical. I'm like going, 20,000. But anyway, what are your, is that a good measure when we're talking church world? And so I'm going to pour gas on the conversation you just had about, how to do success.
Yeah. It's a number that the culture's determined to define success. It represents some sense of influence, and influence can be a positive thing. I guess like any number, it can drive you to destruction and your pursuit of it. Because in some sense, it's power, right? So you got money, you got power, right? And the pursuit of either one of those can be destructive. I don't know if the number's good or bad. I do think it's part of our culture's definition of success to some sense. I think the number without changed lives, which is kind of difficult to do. If you're going to have that many folks, whatever the number is, depending on the size of the city, you're going to have something happening to draw those kind of folks. So I don't know if it's good or bad. I think it's what is. And I think as a pastor, we all know what to say. We all know it. But at the end of the day, when I go talk to a publisher about this book, that number matters. You know what I mean? And just like how many are following you on this or that handle or watching, all those things. So it's hard to say, well, they don't matter, because whether you get your book published, they matter or not. And then whether you're able to do that ministry, the offering number matters on what you can do. So I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it's really good. It shows the contradictions that can occur. And I love that. I kind of love the rawness of the way you answered it. And listen, I read the number when I introduced you. Yes. So it's not, if it was like, no, I'm really uncomfortable with it, I would have left it off. But no, you're right. Publishers look at it. It's a measurement. I think at times those numbers can begin running us instead of us allowing the numbers to just be a descriptor. And again, we've got business people listening in. Is my company a $5 million, $10 million, $20, $30 million company? Those are numbers. How many employees do we have? All those are numbers. There's a question kind of related to that. You brought it up just a second ago, and you mentioned athletics. We talked about you kind of being a coach. I call myself a coach. When I was growing up, both my parents were educators, Troy, and I wanted to probably a teacher and a coach. And then I found out how much money they made, and I didn't want to do it anymore. So I went to Georgia Tech, got an engineering degree and all that. But everything I did, I came back to coaching. I picked up, and I'm going to ask this, I'm going to pose it, I'm going to make it a statement, and then I'll just put a question mark at the end of it. As I was reading this book, Potential, I knew a little bit about your athletic background. I know you're a pastor, so you get up in front of, you get on a stage and you speak. But to me, it seems as if you're sort of a coach at heart. Like that's like a core belief system of you. And even when you get up in front of crowds, maybe larger crowds, you're still interested in that coach aspect of the individual. And that's probably the reason for the book Potential here. We'll talk about the book here in just a second, but would that be accurate or not? And just tell me more based on what I just said.
Yeah. Let me just go back to our other discussion real quick, if that's okay. Because I was thinking, I think when it comes to the numbers, a lot of times the numbers, whatever business, church or whatever, the enemy tends to use those things to push us against one another. Like in the pastoral world, you'll hear someone maybe who leads a smaller number church, whatever number you want to put there, but they'll say, well, that mega church down the road, they whatever, but when that couple is struggling, they come to me for counseling. Now, as someone who might lead a larger church, I would say, yeah, but when your kids want to go to camp, they come to us. In other words, they coexist together, and for the kingdom, they play a different role. I think a lot of times our sense towards numbers is kind of I made a commitment a long time ago when I was at the church we had started that I never asked anybody about their numbers. I never began that discussion there, because if your numbers aren't good, that's the last, because it is evaluated. You know what I'm saying? It's the last question that people ask. So I only bring that up to say, I think in all walks of life, if somehow we realize that there is an important role, a significant role for leaders of all different size companies and churches, and that there's not the perfect size in the sense that we both need each other to be able to best give the folks that we're trying to reach a good product or ministry or whatever it is that we're involved in. When it comes to coaching, that's my heart. I'm a coach as a father. I'm a coach as a husband. I'm a coach as a pastor. I'm a coach as a friend. I think the hardest thing for anybody who comes to Potential Church is to continually be challenged, to not settle. Nothing thrills me more than to see people embrace something new, to go to new places, take advantage of new opportunities. And nothing grieves me greater than to see people waste opportunities or not commit, not willing to give it everything when I was playing basketball in college, in high school, a small school, I grew up in a small town, but when I got to college, we ran 40s. And I had never ran one of those in high school. I didn't play football. I played basketball. I had to run track to play basketball. Coach said that I ran a 40 and I was the fastest one on the team. That surprised the coach and it surprised me. Now, I didn't realize what I was doing because then the coach said, he said, you know what, from this day forward, I expect you to win all our running drills. And I got thrown out of practice one time because I didn't win. Yeah. So I kind of come from that mindset. If you're going to run, you better run with all that you got. I remember we were running down the hill. We had this player 7 foot tall. He falls. We're running hills. He falls. He cuts his hand wide open. And the coach is like, when we get done running, we'll take you to the Mercy. And so nothing grieves me more than to see someone with potential in their marriage or in their walk with God to settle for less than that. So that's what excites me, to get the opportunity to hopefully help people pursue their potential, what God's called and created them to do.
You know, one of the things that a lot of people say is that it's the role of the church to disciple. And a lot of people that sometimes they don't know what that means. They don't understand discipling. And I think sometimes people think that standing up in front of a large crowd and sharing a message is discipling. And there may be parts of it, but I really do think that coaching mindset that you just described, I think that's kind of the heart of discipleship today. Any thoughts on that? Especially since discipleship is such a big word in churches. When I heard you talking about it, I go, he is discipling people because he's got that heart of a coach. And all. So would that be accurate? You want to agree, disagree, or whatever?
Yeah, I think discipleship has a lot of different definitions, and it's one of those things growth is hard. So it's always something we can focus on. We're not doing a good job in this or that. I think what's a disciple? And I think there's nothing more glorifying to God than for us to become what he had in mind when he knit us together in our mother's womb. And so it's the pursuit of that. And what is that? What is it that makes our heart beat? What is it that keeps us up at night? Those kind of pursuits, I think, and to not let people settle for less. Because discipleship gets associated often with knowledge. You know what I mean? What do you know and what do you not know? And it's like, I think I can know a lot and still not be who God's created me to be and experiencing what he's created me to experience. So yeah, I never really understood that. I understand people need to be discipled. I also understand Jesus had difficulty with it. At the end of his ministry, what was 120 people in the upper room? So what makes us think that we're going to reach 1,000 people and have 1,000 disciples or 100 or 50 or whatever the number is? I think a lot of times the problems, what we do as Christians is we advertise things we don't have ourselves. And what I mean, we talk a lot about peace. We talk a lot about joy. We talk a lot about, if you're a true disciple, then those things are evident. And yes, there is a joy and there is a peace, but there are days that I doubt. There are days that I'm discouraged. There are days that I'm troubled, right? And it's that Jesus walks with me through those. Everybody's going to experience those. The scripture and the Spirit and Christ himself give me a constructive way to deal with those things, where somebody else may go down a destructive path. But it's not that I don't experience him. And I think sometimes as Christians, somebody becomes a Christ follower or whatever, and then they're discouraged and they're like, I must have not got it. I didn't get the good stuff or whatever. And it's like, no, there really is a process to this.
We're pretty good at judging the fruits of the Spirit in other people. We're not really good at judging it in ourselves. I think you shared it in the book, but how the heck does somebody come up with the name of Potential Church? I've traveled a lot all over the world, Australia, New Zealand, Europe, all over, and have never run into Potential Church. How'd that come about?
It's kind of a God thing in the sense that we were Flamingo Road originally. Before I got here, it actually used to be Flamingo Road Baptist Church. Then they changed it to Flamingo Road Church. And then we went multi-site. And, pink birds aren't known everywhere. We have a campus in Lingmar. So we said, we need to change our name. In 2010 is when we changed it. And it's like, well, what do we need to be called? And if you went way back to the day of daytimers, okay, for your listeners, this is before smartphones and all that. And you would have to write in the front of it, like your mission or your vision or something like that. And if I could find mine, you go back and it would say something very similar to what our mission statement is today, as far as helping, people reach their potential to become what God's created them to be. That's just been a part of me as far back as I can remember. And I used to take all my guys to go to church with me when I was playing basketball, just that desire to see them become more. And so that's where it came from. And then, in 2010, it's handles were still important. We were able to get all the handles for all the social media stuff, and it fit with who God's created me to be. Because I really think when it comes to pastoring, that God brought me here because of who he made me to be. So it's important I am who I am. Now, when God gets ready to do something different, he's going to bring somebody with a different personality to lead him to a different place. But I can't be all things. You know what I'm saying? I'm not John MacArthur who has a different style. I mean, I can't imagine John MacArthur with some tattoos on his arms. That's not mean his style is bad. It just means I can't. I grew up, for your young listeners, there used to be this thing on the weekend we're going to reach the unchurched. Midweek, we're going to be for the believers. You know what I mean? And it's like, if you were to go back, and we did that. I mean, that was the end thing to do, talk about following, trends. That's what we did. But if you went back and listened to both those teachings, it would sound very similar, because that's who I am, I mean, and I just wish we could have more grace. Truth is truth, and we don't want to drift from the truth. But man, I just wish we could have more grace for one another, and that it's not, I don't want to teach this, or I'm afraid of that, or because if I teach the same thing on a social issue, let's say, that maybe a John MacArthur might teach on that issue, it's just going to sound different for me. It's not that I'm going to say anything different or not be as strong. It's just going to sound different because of the way I'm wired and called to be. And if I try to be John MacArthur, I'm not smart as he is. I have a reputation. And I can't pronounce the Greek language. So I would be in a world of hurt. But that's okay. Where he doing what he needs to be doing.
Oh, we've got these on YouTube, and I just had this vision of when you brought up John MacArthur with tattoos. I had this vision of someone bringing in a graphic with John MacArthur with tattoos, but then I'm thinking, then my next thought goes, we could be liable. There could be some lawsuit. There could be something come up. It would probably generate a lot of interest in all of that. So I love the word potential. In fact, you'll hear me when I wrap up. We're 280 episodes in on this podcast, and my last sentence is always be all that you were created to be, and which to me is the definition of potential. But did you get any pushback at all? I mean, come on, Flamingo Road Church, that is sexy right there. Did someone say, no, we're Flamingo Road, dang it, we are not moving into this potential stuff? I mean, what was that transition like? Was it okay?
Yeah, we worked hard, included people in the whole process. And then I'm sure people said that, they just didn't say it to me, but we didn't have a lot of pushback. And that's the good and the bad of South Florida. It's a very unchurched area. I read an article the other day. West Palm Beach is the most never churched city in the country. So the good with that is there's not a lot of church stuff. People pretty well go along. But the other side of that, they really don't care enough to do other things, so it has the good and the bad.
So somewhere along the way, you've got church going along, you got a lot of things happening, you got podcasts, you got all these cool things going on. You decided to write a book that was by the same name, Potential. And you even talk about in here that writing isn't necessarily your favorite thing. I might be putting words into it, but why write a book?
I feel like this is one of those areas where actually I feel like I was disobedient. There's not a lot of things where I just know God was telling me to do something and I just didn't do it. So God, I feel nudged, and I just like, well, if God wants me to do this, it'll happen. And I don't have a clue what that meant. I was going to fall out of the sky. That's not the way I pastored. That's not the way I fathered. That's not the way so to me, it just came to getting around to just being obedient. I had the ministry team here pushing me and realizing that, because I was always the shy kid, so you continue to wrestle through with that, but realizing too that it would have a positive impact on the church. We live in a day where people go to social media before they visit the church, and we're talking about numbers. They're going to judge before they ever show up whether or not God's there by certain numbers. And the book is just another way to garner influence. I believe in the message with all of my heart. I'm passionate about it. So it just made sense to to go ahead and do it. I learned a lot along the way. It was hard. The writing part was easier than I thought, but the process was a lot more challenging than I realized.
What did you learn about yourself along the way?
I had to wrestle with, and sometimes it's easier to be comfortable not succeeding than to take the risk to succeed. And what I mean by that is, it's one thing to say I wrote a book. I remember hearing John Maxwell a long time ago, he'd sell his books. And some people would be cynical. All he's doing is making money. But I always thought he just really believes in what his message is. I'm sure he made some money along the way, but he really believed in that. And I think being confident enough to say, look, I think this can impact your life in a positive way, it can be encourage you. It's an easy read. It's that kind of thing. But having confidence in it. I can get up and speak with great confidence. English wasn't always my greatest subject when it came to spelling and writing. It's just amazing to me that those things that I felt in middle school and high school, I can still feel as a 56-year-old man. I think the thing I learned about me is still, I don't want to not succeed because I'm more comfortable being the underdog.
Yeah.
As opposed to being the one that's expected. Because, there's always a lot more pressure when you're the one that's expected to win and you don't, whatever that means.
In many ways, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, is like, how do we even measure success in this realm? What is the potential of a book that's titled Potential? Is kind of an interesting conversation to have. I'll say it's a great read. It's not a complex read, which I like, by the way, just so you know. I actually saw a lot of Troy Paragould and Troy, South Florida, that I kind of like the marrying of that in a book like this, because I think it relates to a lot more people. I think it really helps to expand that out. I found for myself, it's really tough for me to multitask when I'm writing. Other things I can multitask. I could speak. Sometimes I could even do this kind of stuff and have other stuff going on I don't like to. But writing, when I'm writing, man, I've got to be on. My mind can't go other places. And that was probably the toughest thing for me about writing, because I'm kind of an action-oriented. You seem action-oriented, and sitting down and putting, 50,000 or whatever, how many words you got here. That's that's a lot of focus there. So, there's one chapter that I loved, and I love in our time together, maybe to kind of unpack that just a little bit. It was chapter 6, where you dove into a little bit of what happened with Potential Church and yourself around COVID. And then you'd been referencing the story of Moses all along, but you really dug in a little bit more to some lessons learned from the life of Moses. What do you want to share here in a couple minutes about that whole chapter? Because to me, that was like the heart of the book.
Yeah, I think the great study of Moses is, this incredible leader that scholars and everyone would agree was an amazing leader, incredibly insecure in some ways. He's perfect, who God chose, right? He was rescued, grew up in the palace. But when God chose him, he was nowhere. He was nobody. And he didn't grow up with the Hebrew teachings. He grew up in the Egyptian God's teachings. God chose him. And he had tried once and failed. And yet, God did something incredible in his life. And I think the biggest challenge to success is discouragement. One of the things that we continue to learn from Moses is that it's never too late. Whether you've made a mistake or you're older than you thought you should be or whatever it is. Because to me, the saddest thing is when you feel that you can no longer reach that potential, accomplish that purpose, live out your destiny. You lose hope in the future and you're just existing.
Yeah, could you picture, I always think about Moses because he was in the palace for 40 years, probably being groomed to be Pharaoh or a type of Pharaoh leader. And then he wasn't in the desert for 40, he was on the backside of the desert. And then for 40 years he spent with, this is going to sound cynical, but with a grumbling, complaining group of church people. He was with a bunch of church people for 40 years. And then at the very end, he got a glimpse of the promised land, but he didn't go into it. I think it goes back to the conversation we were having earlier, Troy, is, we define success in a lot of ways I think if some people were going to define Moses, they would try to say he wasn't successful, but yet thousands of years later, we're still talking about him as one of the greatest leaders of all time, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's no doubt about that. And there's no doubt that I think it's one of the most inspirational but scary, when you think that he missed there, and that just reminds you of the importance of every day.
And like even in our situation where, we'll lift up a prayer on Monday and be disappointed if it's not answered by Friday or Sunday. And Moses is sitting here 40. Anyway, I think about that, especially when I do my read through the Old Testament. Sometimes when I do it chronologically, I'm going, we don't have any perspective on time.
We were enslaved for 350 years. And then when they get free, God takes them the roundabout way. He doesn't take them straight there. And, it's like, oh my goodness.
There's like the second in command, Joshua's in charge, and they're about to go in and fight. And then all of a sudden there's this instruction of like, all right, all y'all need to get circumcised. I don't want to go into detail there, but that would not be like, to me, a great preparation for battle.
Oh, no. It's such a great story. It really is, because we can all identify with it on our journey, no matter where we're at in that journey.
Yeah. Hey, Troy, there's one word that you brought up. I want to bring it up before we kind of wrap up. And I think, let me see if I wrote it down. I had a highlight. I was on page 152. You're talking about leadership. And there's a word you bring up called hubris. Cockiness, arrogance, whatever. We could kind of throw a lot of things in there. I think you're speaking of it as it's one of the challenges that leaders, and again, we've got ministry leaders, we've got corporate leaders, we've got small business leaders listening in. Talk a little bit about how challenging hubris can be, and then we'll wrap up with a couple questions and be done here. So how is that the kryptonite to most leaders, hubris?
Yeah, I think you're going to attract folks who agree with you for the most part in whatever it is that you're doing. And if you have some success, then it's very easy to get caught up in that success and the belief then that leads to what you deserve. This is what I did, and that kind of ownership. And I think humility on the other side is not denying your success, but is understanding from where it comes from. Because if we look at it like Moses and we realize, I'm not guaranteed the promised land. This is, what I mean? God's given me these gifts, and, they're not, what do they say, lifetime warranty kind of thing, that the humility is understanding I'm a steward of this. And, because it keeps you humble, because then you're having to just determine every day, how do I be a good steward of this influence or this position or this money? Because the moment, and I think the reason it's so dangerous is because to become arrogant is to not have to deal with the tension. The moment I start to believe I've earned it and deserve it and it's my right, now I don't have to deal with the tension of, should I do this or, whatever the risk is. But so I think it's just continuing to remind myself, I'm a steward and, I want to finish well. But I think it's a continued challenge. I mean, we see, we screw up until the day we die. So we're never beyond that ability to become arrogant.
Yeah, and one of the things, obviously there's a lot of leaders that have struggled with that. Some have had challenges. Is there anything, just like a quick tip or thought, something that you do to attempt to stay grounded, to keep that humility, to not let that hubris, dis-ease kind of creep in? Anything that you could recommend to other leaders that they can do that?
I think listen. If you're a listening person, you will attract folks who will be honest with you. If you don't listen, then people give up and all of a sudden they only tell you what you want to hear, which as a leader, you got to remember that. For the most part, most people are going to tell you what you want to hear, whether it's the truth or not. They're going to tell you they can do something and then complain later that they have to do it, and not because they're mean. That's just the way we are as humanities. But if you listen to people and you value their opinion, I think you're more likely to get the truth, which can protect you from making a horrific decision.
So I know the book is something people are going to want, but they may want to connect with you or potential church. And I know you've got podcasts and YouTube and that. Troy, tell everybody where they can find you and the book, and we'll include it down in the notes.
Yeah, the book can, wherever they buy books, Amazon, all those kind of things. Would love if they do get it and read it, leave a review. Those things, the algorithm is king when it comes to that kind of stuff. And then as far as me, it's my name, Troy Gramling, on all the social medias. And then for the weekend teachings, you can go to potentialchurch.com or the same with all the social media handles.
All right, very cool. We'll include all that down in the notes. We're Seek, Go, Create. Troy, those three words, you could probably guess the origins of those words. I'm going to allow you to choose one of those over the other two that just resonates more with you, means more. Seek, go, or create, and why?
They're all good words, but I think seek to me is the one that jumps off to me today. And I think it's because I think there's incredible opportunity and curiosity and a willingness to, I think the other two might even come from the first one. And it's easy to lose the desire to seek. Seeking takes energy. And, if you have any kind of success in your life, it's easy to stop seeking, stop reading, growing, learning, asking the questions. So that's one that jumps out at me.
Absolutely. Yep. There's a reason they're in that order too. The Lord spoke those to me a number of years back at one of the lowest points in my life. So Pastor Troy Gramling, I appreciate this conversation. I love you allowing my sometimes interesting and odd questions that I ask. Get a copy of the book Potential. We told you earlier about where you could go. If you are listening in and still with us, especially if you're on YouTube, drop down in the comments, pop a comment in there, talk about Potential, comment on something we've said. And I have an extra copy of the book. Like I said, I got two, and I will pick someone in the comments and drop a copy of Troy's book to you. So, man, this has been a great conversation. Appreciate everyone listening in. Appreciate Pastor Troy taking the time. Looking forward to seeing all the potential that grows out of this. We are Seek, Go, Create. We've got new episodes on YouTube and all the podcast platforms every Monday. Until next time, continue being all that you were created to be.